A very good evening. Ya'ate anotro. Hello in the beauty way, everyone. We are going to acknowledge our caretakers and our traditional people of the lands. We want to talk about our ancestors. We are located on the pueblos, 19 pueblos around us, and we'd like to acknowledge all the people where you're coming from as well. And our nonprofit is dedicated to bridging cultural exchange globally. Tonight, we have a very special guest, Joseph Marshall III. Not enough can be said about Joseph, so I'll keep it very short. Joseph Marshall is one of our living legends. Joseph Marshall learned from his people, his language, his culture, his history, and he's here with us today to share some of his knowledge and his storytelling tonight. And at the end of the show, we are all going to be blessed to have Joseph Marshall answer questions. And we are going to invite you all to come back on. So let's give it up for Joseph. Woohoo!
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. As Tosh said, my name is Joseph. Joe will do just fine. I was born in on a Rosebud Reservation, and I really personally hate to say that is in the state of South Dakota, but South Dakota did become a state in 1889, but the Rosebud Reservation was established in 1881. So we sort of predate the state of South Dakota as far as, the European timeline goes. But my people, the Sichanhu Lakota, or the burnt thigh people, and all the other Lakota people have been around for a long, long time, hundreds, if not thousands of years. So that's sort of generally who I am culturally. I grew up there on the northern part of the reservation. And fortunately for me, I was given to my maternal grandparents. My mother allowed my maternal grandparents, her parents, to take me when I was less than a year old, and they raised me as their own. So for a long, long time, I thought I was their child. And I was somewhat confused when my mother came around to visit, or my father, both of them came around to visit. As a young child, you can imagine, it was kind of confusing as to who they were, because as much as my grandparents tried to correct me when I called them Ina and Ate, or mom and dad, and they corrected me to calling them grandma and grandpa, I still didn't understand what the situation was. Which is fine. It wasn't a big problem in the end. Then later on, I found out what the circumstances were. But fortunately, as I said, I grew up with them, and for that reason, I learned Lakota as a first language because that's all they spoke in their home. And most of the adults that came, most of the native adults that came were Lakota, and of course that was the language back in the 40s and 50s. That was a predominant language. Most people still spoke it then, back in that day. So that's all I heard. I did hear a few words of English from my mother's younger brother, my uncle. My mother now is 92, and my uncle is now 90. But he was in high school, and he would come home to visit. He was at a boarding school, so he was my first teacher of English, because he would say names and phrases in English, and that's how I got started to learn English. And it really didn't matter to me because my world was my grandparents and that place, which was about 150 square miles along the Little White River in northern on the northern tier of the reservation. And that's where I grew up. That's where I played. My companions were dogs and a couple horses, and occasionally a snarky badger and whatever else happened to show up. But growing up that way, uh, was a blessing in many, many ways, not just linguistically, but as far as developing a cultural base. The people who were elders, who were my grandparents' contemporaries, were their friends and relatives. And all of them, or most of them, were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and even older, believe it or not. And all of them spoke Lakota. All of them were knowledgeable about culture, obviously, and certainly about history, and certainly about, you know, what life was like before the Lakota moved up into what is now South Dakota in 1877. My grandparents, keep in mind that their parents, my grandmother was born in 1900, my grandfather was born in 1888, for example. Or at least he thinks it was 1888 because that was the day before birth certificates. So I think that was more or less a guess. So my point is their parents were born in the 1860s and 1850, late 1850s. So that generation, their parents, my great grandparents, had more of a direct connection to what was going on in those tumultuous years during and after the so-called Indian Wars. So they were, for me, a direct link to my own history, personally and culturally. So it was a blessing on several levels. And perhaps one of the most fortunate aspects of growing up that way was everybody was always willing to teach me something or tell me a story or have a conversation with a little boy. And sometimes in a lot of gatherings, I would be the only child or just one of a very few. So it was like being a captive audience. And the two regrets that I have is that I didn't have the kind of recording devices we obviously have now. So what I remember comes from memory. And the other regret is that it was over much too quickly. Eventually, I had to go away to school. Eventually, the outside world came crashing in, so to speak. I had to learn English. I had to contend with whatever was going on with that outside world. But the fortunate part for me was that what I learned from my grandparents and their generation was a basis for a strong sense of identity. I went into the world knowing exactly who I am and who I was at that point in my life. Uh, I am a Lakota. I was a Lakota, and that was the most important thing to me. And so that's the basis that I come from. Geographically, I'm a Sicangu Lakota. Culturally, I'm a Sicangu Lakota. Or in modern terms, that's Rosebud Sioux, which I don't like. But if you're more familiar with that, uh, then that is an identifier for that's more common. Uh, I was told that the sort of the theme for this evening was rise and resilience, which is appropriate, I think, for what we as a certainly as a country, certainly as different indigenous groups, and as a society and as a nation, and as a world, have been going through for nearly a year now. It's for me that's sort of hard to believe that this illness, this coronavirus, has been around for that long. Um, at the beginning of when it's before I knew that it was here, and I hadn't heard anything in the news. I made a trip to Minneapolis, Minnesota, actually St. Paul, Minnesota. I flew up there one day, talked to groups of kids at two alternative schools for Native kids, and then an evening presentation at the University of Minnesota, and then I flew home the next day. And then once I was back, then of course the news started filtering in that there was this virus that had come from China, and it had a potential to to be very deadly. And that was quite an understatement, as we all know now. So if we're going to talk about rising, if we're going to talk about resilience, then it certainly is appropriate in these times. And I'm sort of taken back to stories of the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. And I know about it because my maternal grandmother's younger sister died of that illness when she was only 16. And my grandmother told me about her sister and about how ill she was and when she died and how hard she tried to take care of her. She did take care of her, and I'm sure she took care of her really well. But she told me that illness was something that was worldwide. It was happening all over the world. And it certainly happened in our part of the world up on the Northern Plains. And for me, the story was very personal because uh, my great grandmother Emma, who lived to be only 16, died a few months after she contracted the illness. And my grandmother's stories about her sister were obviously beyond, had much more to do with than just her being ill in that epidemic. They were very close. Of course, they grew up together, and they took care of one another. And when my great grandmother Emma fell ill, my grandmother was the main one who took care of her. And the aspect of that story that gets to me even today, even thinking about it right now, is that my grandmother, whose name was Annie, would cry, would weep every time she told a story. It didn't matter when if she told it when I was 5, 6, 7, or 8, or she brought it up again in the late 80s, 1980s, before she died in 1984. Whenever she told a story, she wept every time. So in that sense, that story is very personal. An interesting sidelight here is that my grandmother's Emma, her given name by her family was Fanny. My grandmother Annie's given name by her family was Nellie, and those were the only names each one of them had. So it was Fanny Good Voice Eagle and Nellie Good Voice Eagle. And when their father and stepfather died, their mother inherited a lot of land, and eventually that land was inherited by my paternal grandmother. But when that transaction was taking place, the transference of ownership of that land to my grandmothers, when they were 16 and 18, they went to the Bureau of Indian Affairs agency, and they had to sign documents. The Indian agent, who was a white man, explained to them what was going on legally so they would understand they were inheriting a lot of land. For whatever reason, known only to this man, the BIA agent, decided to give them different names. So my grandmother Annie became Emma. So that was the name he entered on the title deed to the land, Emma Fanny Good Voice Eagle. And for my grandmother Nellie, he gave her the name Annie. So she was thereafter known as Annie Nellie Good Voice Eagle, because their father's name was Good Voice Eagle. So since those documents were legal, that from that moment on were their legal names. So thereafter, people knew them as either Emma or Nellie. So a lot of my grandmother's old friends that she had grown up with and known her since childhood and afterwards knew her as Nellie. And I knew her as Nellie, but legally she had to go by the name of Annie. And my grandfather's name was Albert Tuhawk. He was 14 years older, 12 to 14 years older than my grandmother. And it was my grandmother's mother my great grandmother who arranged the marriage because he wanted my grandmother to have a protector because she owned a lot of land and she knew people would want that land and would do anything to get it. So she had always been impressed by my grandfather as a man, as a young man. So although they knew of one another, my grandparents really didn't meet and eye to eye and really didn't speak to each other until the day they were married. Uh, and interestingly, they were married for 55 years. They were married in 1920, and they were married for 55 years until my grandfather died in 1975. So that's where I come from. That's the basis of my identity as a human being, certainly, and certainly as a Lakota person. They were strong people, my grandparents, and that whole generation were very, very strong and resilient people. They had to be because they were the second generation going through traumatic change. We Native people now, no matter what our tribe, don't know enough about what our parents and certainly our grandparents went through in those first days of assimilation when the government came down really heavy handed uh, and did things like forbidding them to speak their own language. This was especially at the reservation, at the government boarding schools, the government boarding schools as well as the parochial boarding schools. That was the number one rule. You did not speak your own language, and punishment was doled out if somebody broke that rule. And many people did break the rule in spite of the fact that they knew they were being punished. Talk about resilience. And it was those resistors and those who stood up for their culture by speaking their language. Those kind of people are the ones who are responsible for passing the language and the culture from one generation to the next. Otherwise, we probably would have lost more of the cultures, especially up north, than we have had to that point. So our grandparents and our great grandparents certainly knew the meaning of resilience because they had to be. There was no other choice. There was, as I said, life under the control of the federal government, the Indian Bureau, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and essentially of a lot of churches, mainly the Catholic Church, was not easy because assimilation was in full swing. And the government's stated policy, and those of us who are Native know this, and if you don't, you should. So my apologies for telling you something you already know, but it's worth talking about, and it's worth knowing our history, especially in terms of that we're able to be resilient. The government's mantra for that period of time was to kill the Indian and save the man. In other words, the Indian part of us, the Native part of us, the indigenous part of us, our culture, our languages, our values, our rituals, all of that was to them no good. They didn't want us living by those values. They didn't want us practicing our spirituality. And so they did everything in their power to take those away from us. So you can understand why out of now we have over 500 and some identifiable, more than that, identifiable Native tribes, indigenous tribes and groups. You can understand why out of that nearly 600, perhaps more, Native groups, that only about 160 of those groups still speak their native language. So the efforts of the federal government, the efforts of the Catholic Church and white missionaries in general did have an impact, unfortunately. But fortunately, there were enough people who remembered the ways, spoke the language, taught their children, and so forth. So I'm one of the lucky ones. I was born in 1945, and I grew up speaking the Lakota language. And unfortunately, I'm the last generation of first language speakers. There are that in a broad term. There are some of our children who know how to speak it, but not to the broad base that we did. So we're essentially the last, and as far as Lakota is concerned, probably the last first generation Lakota speakers, first language Lakota speakers. And the fact that there are native cultures still existing in all of those tribes is a testimony to human resilience, and certainly a testimony to our specific resilience as individual indigenous tribes. And the reason I've been talking about this and sort of reminding us, those of us who know, is because of what's happening now. Globally, we're facing something that more or less happened, not the same illness, but happened on a similar scale back in 1917 and 18. Since then, nothing like this has happened. And I think the axiom, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, is happening. Because even though historians and people who lived through it are trying to remind or teach the rest of us that this has happened before. And one of the sad stories back in 1918, the second wave of the influenza, because people got tired of isolating and people got tired of the restrictions that were put on them, and they decided to break free, as it were, and go out and mingle with others. And that gave the disease, the opportunity to come back in strength. And that second surge was what killed more people than the first. And maybe that's what's happening now. I hope not. I hope not. I just came back from South Dakota, and I had to travel, obviously, through Nebraska and Colorado. But I spent essentially the summer up in South Dakota, listening to the news and sort of watching what was going on around relative to COVID-19. And the tribes were doing their best to prevent as many of their tribal members from catching the virus. They imposed restrictions. They set up roadblocks so that outsiders wouldn't come into the reservations, much to the anger of the governor of South Dakota and some of the people of South Dakota. She tried to take issue with the tribe's ability to protect themselves. And of course, in the end, she lost because she did not have the power to stop the tribes from setting up roadblocks. For a while, the isolation and the shutdown and those kind of things worked, but the tribes imposed the mask rule. And when I arrived up in South Dakota in June, the only people I saw wearing masks on the reservation and even off were Native people, were Lakota people. And other people, other non-Native people on the reservation were wearing masks. But once off the reservation, in the neighboring towns and in the rest of the state, where there were no reservations, no one was wearing masks. It's as if this coronavirus was not happening. And even though a few mayors, a few state leaders were trying to listen to science and suggest that people should wear masks, the governor was of the position that it imposed on individual freedoms. So, of course, now South Dakota or North Dakota are the states with the two highest incidents of more cases of COVID-19, because the political leadership is ignoring ignoring science. And once again, the only people wearing masks on reservations are the Native people, the Lakota people. And I think maybe that's because as Indigenous people, we have known hardships and we have not forgotten. The stories live on with us. Some stories are like it happened just yesterday, because in at least in my language of Lakota, there is no word for time. We do not have culturally the linear definition of time like Europeans do or the rest of the world does. We don't. There is no word for time. We have words for morning, evening, afternoon, night, and dawn, and sunset, and so on. But those are not words that denote time. Those are words that describe parts of a day. So, when we tell a story, we generally say "ehunk eha," which means a long time ago. We acknowledge that things happened way back when. We don't say, 270 years ago or 1,000 years ago. We simply say there was in the past, sometime in the past. So when we tell stories, as I said, sometimes it feels like it happened just yesterday. So that's why when we tell stories of our culture and of hard times, we immediately connect with those stories because they have nothing to do with time. They have to do with the subject of the story. And most of those stories, a lot of the stories, the mythical stories, as some people call them, have morals to the story, have a point, and teach something. But I'm going to tell one here in a bit before we end. But the one thing that strikes me most of all, as someone who is part of what's happening now, who is a citizen of a tribe, who is a citizen of this country, and certainly a citizen of the world, like all of us are. I'm alarmed because a lot of people, and I don't know how many, I can't put numbers to it, I can't put percentages to it. A lot of people don't seem to care about our fellow human beings. Because putting on a mask is certainly a demonstration that we care about others. And we as Indigenous people care about others because that was one of the basic values of our various cultures. We took care of one another. We cared about what happened to our families and our relatives and everybody else in the village and the community. We cared because we knew everybody else. We knew that whatever happened to them might happen to us, and that we were taught that we were part of the solution as well as we could be part of the problem. So having learned those values and having seen those values demonstrated in my childhood, more so than now, I'm appalled at how many people simply do not care for our fellow human beings. And right now, I'm seeing, as far as politics is concerned, and of course, along with the pandemic, now we're embroiled here in this country in the middle of an election process, and we've got 6 days to go before we try to find solutions to a lot of problems. And one of the problems is the man who is, or the person, I hesitate even to call him a man, is the being that is occupying the White House and is using the title of president. I don't know about you all, and I don't know what your political proclivities are, but he is not my president for a lot of reasons. But there is a story that sort of illustrates what is happening. And in our culture, we have a character called Iktomi. Iktomi has sort of dual personalities. On one hand, he's a very pitiful little being. On the other hand, he's sort of a trickster, and he can resort to either of his persona to get what he wants. And his twin brother is Ea the giant, and he's one of the characters, a creature that exists in some of our old creation stories. So I'm gonna briefly tell you a story about this character called Iktomi, and for the edification of the interpreters, he is a trickster. He is not to be trusted. He is a pitiful being, and he goes to any length to get what he wants. Iktomi is always hungry. He never has a home. He is not a hunter. He's not a gatherer. He is always hungry. He's always looking for a place to lay his head, and it's usually somebody else's abandoned home. And he's always looking for his next meal because he never does anything to set aside any food or make any preparations for the future. So that gives you a glimpse into this trickster's character. The trickster woke up one morning in a den in the hillside. And of course, it was somebody else's abandoned den. And the first thing that he felt when he woke up, which was late morning, not early morning by any means, were the pangs of hunger. And which was nothing new to him because he was always hungry. He was always hungry. He was a skinny, pitiful little being because he was not a good hunter. So the first thing on his mind was, what am I going to do about food? Where am I going to find food? And nowhere in those thoughts were any inclination to go out and hunt and do anything skillfully to procure food. He was going to rely on what he thought were wits to help himself, and unfortunately, he didn't have a lot of those. So he sat outside this den for a while and wondered what to do. And he looked around, and it was a nice day. It was not a cold day. And in the distance was a hill, so he would walk to that hill, to the top of that hill, and sat and looked around, and all he saw was more prairie and more hills, and certainly nothing in the distance that would indicate that there was any kind of food available easily. So he went to another hill and another. And after several times of casting about and looking for food, and he had found some green berries that didn't taste very good, but that was the extent of it. He sat on the hill and wondered what he was going to do, and started to feel sorry for himself, which he did on a regular basis. He heard voices on a breeze that wandered by. He heard voices, and he wondered where they were coming from. And so he walked in another direction and stopped, and then went in another direction, went to the north and stopped on the hill, and then he could hear the voices. They came in a little clearer. So he listened, and the voices sounded cheerful and happy. And he thought he even detected singing. So he hurried toward the direction of the voices. And as he walked, the voices got a little louder and a little louder and a little clearer. And indeed, there were happy voices that were singing. And as he came over a rise, in the near distance, he saw a lake, a small lake, a pond. And on it were what he was certain were ducks, laughing and singing and splashing around on the water. A large flock of ducks on the water. And they were the ones who were singing and laughing and having a good time. And of course, Iktomi didn't care about the singing. He cared that these ducks were potentially food. But the next problem was, it was one thing to see the potential of food, but how would he trap them or entice them in some way so that he could maybe have 3 or 4 of them somehow to eat? Well, he sat for a while and he thought, and slowly a plan began to form in his mind. He looked around and began to see what he might need to put his plan in motion. So he went down to a thicket and he began to gather up twigs, long twigs, maybe 2 or 3 feet long. And he placed those bundles of twigs. He formed a bundle of with those twigs, and he tied them together in a very large bundle that he hefted onto his back. And then he started walking in the general direction of the ducks on the lake, who were still singing and laughing and having a good time. And he walked like someone with a purpose, bent under his load of sticks. And he got closer and closer to the ducks. And of course, the ducks knew about Iktomi, that he was not to be trusted, that every word out of his mouth was likely a lie. So they spotted him, and so they retreated in the water. And he watched him. But he wasn't walking in their direction. He was walking paralleling the lake, more or less, and really not paying attention to them. He was carrying this load of sticks, and he was walking very resolutely in a direction, and soon enough he would walk past them. And the ducks watched, and they became curious. You know, they thought that Iktomi would come after them, but of course he wasn't. He was going past them. So they called out to him, "Iktomi, trickster, my friend, where are you going?" And he walked on. He walked on like he didn't hear them. So they called out again, "Hey, where are you going?" And so he stopped. The trickster stopped and looked around and acted surprised that he could see the ducks on the water. And he stopped and he pointed off toward the east. He said, "I'm going over here. I'm going to a very important ceremony. And these things that I'm carrying, this load on my back, are sacred songs. I'm taking these sacred songs to this ceremony. They're waiting for me." And he started walking again under his load. And of course, the ducks were intrigued because Iktomi was walking away from them, but that he had mentioned the ceremony in sacred songs. So they called out, "We want to go with you." And Iktomi stopped. "No, you cannot go with me. This is a very, very sacred ceremony, and only those people who were specially invited can come, and that does not include you." And he turned around and started walking away. And of course, the ducks wouldn't take no for an answer. Their feelings were kind of hurt, as a matter of fact. And they went closer, they swam closer to the shore and called out, "No, we want to go." And Iktomi said no. So the ducks didn't give up. So one of them said at least, "Well, if we can't go, then maybe you can sing us one of those sacred songs. We would like to hear one of those sacred songs." The trickster stopped. And he looked at the ducks, who were now closer to the shore. He seemed to be deep in thought, pondering their question. And he looked off to the east, and then he looked back at the ducks. And he said, "Fine. It may get me in trouble, but I will sing you one song." Saying that, he laid down his bundle. He said, "But because this is a sacred song, there are 2 rules that I must impose. One, you must be quiet and listen, And two, you must close your eyes once I start singing the song. And of course, the ducks were feeling very fortunate that they would hear a sacred song, and they said, we will follow your directions." And so Iktomi stopped, and he picked out a long, particularly heavy stick from his bundle, and he stopped and he said, "Okay, this is the song I have chosen. So now it is time for you to close your eyes because I will start singing. And once I start singing, you cannot open your eyes. And if you open your eyes, they will turn red." So the ducks assured him again, "Yes, yes, we will do that. We will do that." So Tommy started singing. And I'm not going to sing because I'm not a very good singer. But he did start singing and drumming at the same time. He was, patting with his hands, and he was singing. And the ducks started dancing on the water. They kept their eyes closed, and they started flapping their wings and dancing on the water, feeling very, very fortunate that they were hearing a sacred song. And of course, Iktomi really got into the song. He started singing, and as he did, he walked closer and closer and closer to the water's edge. And he sang louder and louder. And the more he sang, the more the ducks really got into it, as it were, and they were dancing and slapping their wings on the water. And Iktomi slowly waded into the water. And he kept singing, and the ducks kept their eyes closed, and they kept dancing. And Iktomi grabbed that big, heavy stick, and he started swinging it, and he hit a duck, and he killed it, and he swung it and hit another duck, and he killed that, and he kept singing the whole time. And one duck opened his eyes and saw what Iktomi was doing. He was singing and swinging that club and killing killing off all his relatives. So the duck shouted, "Open your eyes and fly away. Iktomi's killing us." Of course, so all the ducks opened their eyes, and to their alarm, they saw what Iktomi was doing. He had tricked them. So they flew away. But Iktomi was lucky enough to have killed maybe half a dozen ducks. And interestingly enough, there is a breed of ducks who have red eyes. And it must have been those particular ducks who didn't listen to Iktomi. So that's the story. That's the story. And it sort of coincides to something that happens every 4 years. All the politicians come out and tell their story and sing their songs and make their promises. That's what's happening now. But the main one has been singing the song for 4 years, and too many people have been listening to him. And the moral of the story is, do not listen to Iktomi when he's singing. So give that story some thought and see if you agree that it's certainly appropriate with the times. And hopefully we'll find some semblance of sensibility. And maybe enough of us will have enough sense to be resilient against all of the songs that we've been hearing, all of the misinformation, and do what's right for all of us. So that's my political stump speech for the moment. So I'm done, and I'm certainly will wait for the next segment. Thank you.
Oh my goodness gracious. Thank you very much. Ahihet, Ayisabeth, Joseph Marshall III. Thank you very much. And we love you. And we have been enamored with your stories tonight. Thank you. Before we continue, I'm going to just say really quickly, I have some announcements to make. Next week, we have a very special guest. We have Tiokasin Ghost Horse. He's going to grace us with his stories, his rising, his resilience. We met him in New York City many years ago, and very nice man. He's a radio broadcaster. He walks the red road in a big way. And check our IndigenousWays.org for more information. Right above me, you can see how to get onto our website. It's very easy, it's very user friendly. We have Wisdom Circle, wonderful speakers and guests, and we also have that's every Wednesday. And then once a month on the third Saturday, we have a musical performance. All of these have ASL interpreters, and this event is a free event. And we're grateful to say that our video is on our website. You will be able to see this video in the next 48 hours, and please share it. We want to share as much of this wisdom as we can of Joseph Marshall III, along with 55 other Indigenous presenters and artists. And you can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter at IndigenousWays.org. It's a click away. Just put in your name and your email, and you'll hear our events. All our virtual events have ASL interpreters, and we're so grateful. They are free. We would not be doing this without our sponsors. We worked quickly when this coronavirus epidemic happened. Our festivals were canceled, our events were canceled. We reached out to our donors and said, "Can we do this platform?" And they said yes. So we want to say a special thank you to National Endowment of the Arts, Westaff, Westaff Cares, New Mexico Arts, New Mexico Humanities and Council, and National Endowment of Humanities. Thank you all. We also would like to give a shout out to our board members who are spectacular human beings that are walking on this planet with us, our beautiful Mother Earth. And we'd also like to thank our individual donors that have found us on this platform. I'd like to just give a quick shout out to our beautiful trip, our beautiful mountain called Black Mountain Ziligine is what it's called. This mountain has never been assimilated in the ways of the colonial people. It's still traditional dirt road. We still have to haul water up there. There's still no running water. This is where I come from. This is where my grandmother's from. We have a list of items that were specially requested from our Chinle health worker. You can see all that on our website. And as we keep moving along, we're going to have our trip back up to Black Mountain for the 5th time. Next week, Friday, Elena and I will be driving up, and we have some beautiful volunteers in Santa Fe that are helping us put and organize all these boxes, water barrels, hand washing stations. We have blankets, gloves, scarves. If you want to donate and help, please go to our Indigenous Ways website, or you can send us a donation via PayPal. There's a YouTube also, youtube.com/Indigenous Ways. And there's also Twitter. You can like our social media as well. So I'm going to tell you, we put together a project, Native Women Swing States. We want to reach out to because we want all women to vote, all people to vote, really, because it is our right. We fought for it. We undertook this project we just finished, and we would like to take this moment to share the Native women voices, especially in swing states around the country, to all Native people, especially women. One moment, please.
We were given the right to vote as Native women in 1924.
We have the future generations that we must think about.
I'm voting because I believe in change.
I'm voting in this election as a voice for my children, for the environment, and for the people.
Why should Native American women vote? Because it is our right.
And as an Indigenous female, I'm still fighting for my basic civil rights.
Our thoughts, our visions, our voices need to be counted. They need to be heard.
We need to protect our water. We need to protect our air.
As Native women, we need to get out and vote. Plan your vote, be safe and vote.
Vote, 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 vote.
All right.
We're given the right to vote.
That is a project that we put together very quickly. I have to give credit to Elena for her countless hours on this deadline project. So I'm just going to say really quickly that can you believe it? National Congress of American Indians says 1 to 10% of Native Americans vote. 1 to 10%, get that around, let's get that around our head here. 34% of our communities of voting age are registered to vote. Let's say that again. 34% of the Native Americans, which is, I believe, 1% of this country's population, have even bothered to register to vote. We want that to change. We want that to change. If you have already voted, thank you. If you haven't voted yet, you need to walk your absentee vote to your county clerk's office. We encourage you, do not post at this stage in the game. There's some mail issues going on from what I'm understanding. We encourage you to take 3 of your friends and family who have not yet voted to go and vote. Give them a ride there. Show them how to do it. It's easy. It's simple. And if they haven't registered, get them to do that too. And get them to vote. We all matter. Our voices count. And so does our future generations who have yet to come. Our ancestors fought the women's suffrage movement. The Native Americans didn't start voting. Black people didn't start voting until way into the game this country was formed. Okay, this country was here before, but please share this video with all your networks. It's free as well. You can find this video on all our social media pages, and we're happy to send it to you. Send us a chat with your email address or your Facebook information, and we will send this video to you. It's 58 seconds long, powerful. Okay, I want to invite everybody to come on in. Turn on your cameras. Turn off your mute buttons. Let's talk to Mr. Joseph Marshall III. And real quickly, as everybody's joining on right now, Keely Purcell, thank you very much. On Facebook, Keely says, this is wonderful. And that's a terrible statistic that we just shared. It is substantiated. Calvin Smith. We're going over here to Calvin Smith. I am a huge fan and have an autographed copy of one of his books. When we have FaceTime, I'll tell you how I came to be an admirer of this amazing gentleman. If you notice, we equate Joseph Marshall III with some of the best oral speakers because of his diction. Not only is Lakota his first language, but his diction of the English language. If you don't believe me, buy his books. This guy can write. Judy Shapiro, I want to give a shout out to you. Thank you for your work with all the Native American people for the last 40 years. Judy is a part of the team that I'm opening it up. We'll talk about all this later, but thank you for being here, Judy. Let's go around and open it up. Candy, would you like to start?
Absolutely. Hello, Joseph.
Hi, Candy.
So wonderful to see you and to hear your strong, powerful words, particularly in this time. I really appreciate your candor. And I have to thank you for keep going because it has served me well this year. And I've sent people to your video because it's so powerful in these times.
Good. Thank you. Thank you.
Judy Shapiro.
Hi.
Hi, Judy.
Good to see you all. I think Tosh was trying to tell me to say that I spent a lot of my summer defending those checkpoints over at Cheyenne River. That's my job.
That's good. I'm glad. Glad
to
hear that.
Yeah, it's the tribes there are standing up for the right to protect people in ways that the state is not.
Right. Exactly.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Candy. Donna, would you like to say something?
Okay, hi. It's always inspiring to hear the words from the indigenous peoples of this country. It just always gets me. And thank you for your words tonight, Joseph.
You're welcome. I'm glad you could be part of it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Yolanda, would you like to say something with to Joseph tonight?
I learned so much about Native American culture. It was so inspirational to me. And I have to say that I am fascinated and I just want more. Wonderful, wonderful, heart-wrenching presentation. I'm so very touched. Thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Yolanda. We're glad you joined us tonight. And I'm going down the list here. Mr. Richard, would you like to say some words? Can't hear you.
I came in a little late. I'm sorry about that. But Mr. Joseph Marshall, you do have the voice. You do have the knowledge. You are the elder, and I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. We need more elders to step forward. The youth need us. And we are, every day for me is Indigenous Peoples Day, and we all are part of the 7th generation. So now is the time. And I'm happy to see the youth doing what they're doing. We need more of it. Standing Rock really showed the world that the 7th generation really is here. That the Idle No More movement, as if Native people were ever idle. But I just want to say thank you. I want to hear more of you. I want to hear more elders come out. I've known a lot of the ancestors who've passed. I've been a very lucky white man, and I've been listening to the elder brothers and sisters ever since I was a kid. Because if you know kids, if they're not taught by their elders or by their parents, they can figure it out on their own. When I heard the stories of what was going on with Native people, I knew who was right, and it wasn't us. It was the Indigenous people who were right. You've always been right, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for the work you're doing as well, your radio show and the poetry you're putting on in San Francisco. Thank you very much. I want to tell you, Joseph Keeley Purcell, or let's see, Keeley Purcell says, I'm a Winnebago tribal member and used to work in a bookstore in Rapid City, and your work was one that was always a bestseller. Mr. Marshall, thank you so much for sharing your story tonight about Iktomi. I could not agree more about the being in the White House. And I'd like to ask Arletta, our good friend from Lukachukai, if she'd like to share some words. Nation.
I missed a part of your story, but fascinating and such a wonderful story about Iktomi, the trickster. Thank you for sharing that.
I'm glad you liked it. Thank you.
All right. We have.
Yes, I so enjoyed it very much.
Good. Good.
Thank you again.
Caleb, would you, thank you, Arletta. And Caleb, would you like to say some words tonight?
No, thank you. No.
Thank you so much for being here, Caleb. We really appreciate you, appreciate all of you. And let's give it up for Joseph Marshall III tonight, everybody. Woohoo!
Thank you all very much.
And I'd like to acknowledge Elena, who does all this work. Thank you, Elena, for all the work you do. I think we don't thank you enough. She does all the back end stuff here. So we wouldn't be doing this without Elena and all her tireless hours. And we would definitely not be having the show we have without our beautiful interpreters. I'd like to give a big shout out to Chandra and Zoel for the amazing interpretation they provided tonight for our deaf and hard of hearing members of our communities on a global scale. And next week, you guys, don't forget Tiokasin Ghost Horse. He's a radio station man that does the Red Road out of New York City. I've known this man, and he's a good man. He's got some good stories. So come on in next week, you guys. And
could I say one thing? I don't know if anybody saw that film about 20 years ago called Follow Me Home by Peter Bratt and his brother Benjamin. It's on. It's being screened free tonight, tomorrow night, and Friday. Go to my Facebook page, Richard Allen, ALAN. Scroll down, and then you see "Follow Me Home." Put it in, and then sign up, because afterwards they're going to have a discussion. This is a film that was relevant, and I don't know what happened to it. I saw it 4 times, and then it went away. It's now back. I tell everybody I know this is one of my top 5 films I've ever seen in my life. And this film is about artists going to the White House and painting the colors of this country. But it's much more than that. It's so much more than that. The elders and the ancestors are in this movie. I can't say enough about it. So please, please, everyone, watch it. And it's now going to be available. But please watch it. It's a great film.
Okay.
Thank you, Richard. And we got a last statement I'm going to read from the Facebook from Peg Albert. Thank you, Peg, for joining us tonight. Peg says to you, Joseph, thank you so much. I'm Cherokee and was never allowed to learn my culture. I appreciate you so much for sharing. I find it very interesting that it seems as though history is repeating itself. And these are my words, Tosh, to Joseph. Your medicine, your walk, your talks, who you are, your books. Thank you. We are hungry. We are hungry for you, your words, your history, everything you've got to say. You're always welcome back. We just got another post from Little Cloud Mo Mpajinga, and it says, I once read one of Joseph's books, and there was a story about an animal will not go on a certain path or trail until its time in this world is over. So I think I'll stop there. We're at the top of the hour, past the top of the hour, Indian time, you name it. Thank you, everybody. We love you. We love you. We love you. Let's keep this going. Let's keep this going, everybody. Wear your masks.
Right.
Think about the next person. Buy Joseph Marshall's books. Go to his page.
Thank you.
Support Joseph Marshall. Not that he needs it. He's got Creator and everybody else supporting him, but God, Joseph Marshall, we can learn so much from this man. Let's give it up for Joseph Marshall, everybody. Woo!
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Till next week. Love you, love you, love you. Be well, be safe. Be well, be safe.